It's a commonplace now that globalization makes international cooperation more urgent. When people use that expression, they're usually referring to prudential international cooperation, having to do with things like self-defense, environmental security, public health. But I also think, and what I want to focus on, is how globalization makes international cooperation more urgent in a moral sense, and particularly with respect to efforts to alleviate poverty and destitution in developing countries. The best available statistics suggest that poverty, though still widespread, desperate, and unconscionable, has declined. The percentage of people living on under $1 a day has declined from 28% to 24% in the last 12 years or so. About half of that having to do with improvements in China. If you go back further in time to 1970, the rate of under 5 mortality among children has been cut in half. Life expectancy has gone from 49 to 60 in low-income countries. Illiteracy has fallen from 62% to 39% in developing countries, in low-income countries. Despite these improvements, however, I would argue that the moral claims of global poverty on the consciences of the well-to-do and on the obligations of their governments is actually greater now than it was in the past. Part of the reason is that there are more numbers of poor people in absolute numbers. But I think it's a little bit more than that. I want to develop this little idea about what our obligations are to the poor and developing countries. On one view, at one extreme, you shouldn't really spend $1 on a movie, on your daughter's college education, or even for a fundraiser for your local hospital, if there's someone whose opportunities are worse in, say, Pakistan. At the other extreme is a view that the needs of the poor in Pakistan are the business of the government in Pakistan. And if you send money there, that money might well end up in the hands of people you don't like, or in the hands of people who don't really need the money. So there's a kind of divergence between the moral views we share among people in our own country and that which we tend to think about internationally. It's sort of odd because it leads to a view in which the moral standings of individuals are different depending on where they are. At the same time, it seems to be somehow related to the realities of international politics and to accept their forces. As a result, I think most people adopt a kind of intermediate position, which is that your own family and community come first, but you should help to alleviate destitution in poor countries to the extent that you can. And here's where globalization comes in. It's precisely because it makes it possible to do more that we should do more for poor people in developing countries. The major impediment to mitigating world poverty now is not primarily knowledge, and it's not the cost of it, even at this stage. The problem is international coordination and the absence of international institutions to accomplish that task. This also has a corollary, which is that I think there's a moral obligation to build stronger international institutions so that more can be done, and we can treat, say, children in Pakistan the way that we would treat people in our own communities. Now, what should these new international institutions look like? What's the architecture? There's a lot of debate about this now. Obviously, the protests in Seattle, the protests in Washington that kept me out of my office for a couple of days, protests in Europe around G8 meetings all indicate the extent of disagreement about what these should look like. I have a colleague who went to England to do a little bit of, who had a meeting there and ended up with a pie in his face. He was a Brahmin from a Brahmin family in southern India, and he was just at least very grateful that it was not one of those meat pies that they like to eat over there in England. So if there are any potential pie throwers out there in the audience, please keep vegetarianism in mind. Now, I have my disagreements with a lot of these, policy disagreements with a lot of the protesters. Nevertheless, I do think that on balance, it's good that people are clamoring on the issue of global poverty. The disagreements focus on a variety of issues like trade liberalization, monetary policy and exchange rates, deregulation of capital flows, environmental impact assessment, privatization of state-owned enterprises. To a quote-unquote insider, I think the technical differences on these areas, though real, is actually not as large as the rhetoric might suggest. And I think that the real disagreements actually lie a little bit deeper. They are about two things as I see them. The first is is a disagreement about an acceptable time frame for achieving deep poverty alleviation in developing countries. People who work in international institutions tend to take a medium time frame view. Let's try and have some sort of impact in 5 to 10 years. For a lot of people protesting, that's too long, and the kind of poverty reduction contemplated is not deep enough. At the same time, I think people who have been protesting on the streets also take a much longer time frame in mind at times and think about the fate of the earth 100 years from now and want action on that issue right now. The other kind of disagreement is about, I think it's basically whether in particular contexts market failure is greater than government failure, and whether markets or state institutions are the best route to achieving certain kinds of poverty reduction. Professor Bardhan focused on some of the controversial issues. I want to set those aside for the moment and try and talk about what I see as some commonalities, some shared elements between the protesters and people on the quote-unquote inside that might help to build stronger international institutions, which I think we're morally obligated to do. First commonality, eclecticism of means. Mainstream development economists used to think that underdevelopment was primarily a shortage of savings and investment. If governments could increase their savings and promote capital investment, developing countries would, quote, take off. But a lot of experiences around the world, particularly say in a country like India, which has high savings rates, shows that there's more to simply savings the more to development than simply savings and capital investment. And that's really kind of a limited conception of the development process. Economists outside this sort of mainstream view in the dependency school used to believe that integration into the world economy led to the extraction of domestic capital and into an inevitable decline in the terms of trade. But countries like South Korea and Taiwan that integrated into the world economy at a time when the world economy was growing rapidly shows that that view also isn't entirely complete and has some problems with it. One insight from that first approach remains useful. Some countries, and particularly some regions within them, suffer from a kind of vicious circle in which decisions to invest in a large scale, at a large scale depend on the size of the market. But the size of the market, in turn, depends on decisions to invest in production. So there's kind of a trap. But what's visible now is that this kind of trap isn't limited to decisions about investments, production, and market size, but appears all over the economy. Here's some examples. Say in child labor. Wages in some places might be too low for adults to go to work. They'd rather take care of children, do other kinds of labor that aren't wage remunerated. Part of the reason the wages are too low is because children are out there working, keeping the wages low. If you could somehow get a bunch of children into school, wages for adults and for that kind of activity would rise. More adults would work and more kids would go to school. It's a similar kind of trap. Firms, often in developing countries, don't do a lot of research and development. Part of the reason they don't do that is because there isn't a large stock of knowledge to help them take advantage of that research and development. But if more other firms would do a little bit of this, then they would be more likely to do it. Again, there's kind of a trap there. More generally, limited household income and assets constrain public revenue collection and investment, which then keeps education and health services low and the earning power of individuals low. And low levels of market development lead people to develop personalized networks of exchange, kind of informal systems of sort of, patronage or helpfulness or contacts among family friends. But then those kinds of relations are precisely the kind of institutions that prevent the emergence of market institutions, which might promote growth. I could add a lot more examples, but the bottom line really that I want to draw right now is that there's no single or even one primary obstacle to development. And therefore, there's no single solution to what could make countries better off. International institutions working in this area and bilaterals, foundations, I think should resist efforts to focus on one particular approach to development, say just focusing on macroeconomic management, or just focusing on basic needs in health and education, or just focusing on trade issues. We really need to be working on all areas at once because we don't really know what makes some countries better off at any given time. Second area of agreement, broad outcome measures. The economist Amartya Sen, drawing on a long philosophical tradition, has persuasively argued that what matters in development is not average per average per capita income, which people used to believe, say 20 or 30 years ago, and not even the distribution of income or consumption, but people's capabilities for living rich, full lives. So now, in international institutions, when there are reports on the development status of countries or regions, what's included is not only per capita income, but literacy rates, under 5 mortality, things like that. I think that's a welcome advance. Perhaps in another 20, 30 years, what constitutes development will be expanded even further, and we might be able to think about empowerment or engagement or something like that as an element in our assessment of where countries stand. I should point out, though, that this does not, in my view, have any simple policy consequences. You can achieve improvements in human capabilities through broad labor-intensive growth in both agriculture and manufacturing, as, say, some of East Asian countries did, or you can do it through social programs, as, say, Chile or Costa Rica have done. Either way is fine. And in fact, some social spending, a lot of it doesn't really reach the poor. For example, in 1990, of the health spending in Brazil, only 8% of the total amount of spending went to the bottom 20% of households in terms of income. In Nicaragua, in education spending, it was only 8% of it that went to the bottom quintile. By contrast, the poorest quintile was the beneficiary of 29% of health spending in Malaysia. Education spending tends to be less well-targeted on the poor because so much goes to higher education, which the poorest attend with far less frequency. And I just want to point out that what people agree on now is shared outcomes. We should be looking at not only income but health and education, but that there are a variety of means to improve that, to improve people's opportunities or capabilities in life. Third area of agreement is international public goods. Professor Bardhan stole my thunder on this particular issue. But basically, most development assistance is to particular countries. The IMF, the World Bank may make loans to countries. Bilateral assistance is also for particular countries. But still, there are certain kinds of things that a lot of poor countries could benefit from, but no one of them is willing to pay for, is willing to bear the entire cost for on their own. These are international public goods, like research to enhance the nutrient value of grains, or, and this is something that I'm working on, vaccines. I can't emphasize enough how striking it is that we don't have a mechanism for doing this yet. What I think we need to do, and it's being contemplated in the case of vaccines, is have a regular means of raising revenue from the donors that goes into a fund, but then disbursement from that fund that's conditional on certain kinds of things. Right now, development assistance, it's raised and given out right away. I think breaking that link would be important, so that in the case of vaccines, you would say, countries would routinely pony up some money every year into a fund, and that money would be dispersed only when, say, a vaccine of a certain kind of efficacy and safety is demonstrated. I think that's actually a principle for development assistance broadly, and not just for the case of international public goods. Let me say a few more words about vaccine research. Malaria kills about 3,000 kids under the age of 5 every day, the vast majority in Africa. The annual worldwide toll of AIDS is over 3 million and rising. The same kinds of things that contribute to the prevalence of these diseases, poverty and illiteracy, make it hard to treat them and to prevent them. It's very hard to convince people to spend money on treated bed nets for malaria, to avoid working outdoors in the evenings when mosquitoes are flying around, to use condoms when their lives are otherwise so fragile to begin with. As a result, a lot of people believe the best thing that can be done for these kinds of diseases is to come up with a vaccine. But most of the world's research in health is not focused on the needs of developing countries. The World Health Organization estimates that about 10% of the world's medical R&D is devoted to disease conditions that account for 90% of the total disease burden on human beings. There are about 40 or so AIDS vaccine candidates that have now undergone phase 1 and 2 trials, but only a few are targeted to the subtypes of HIV that are prevalent in Africa and South Asia. The fundamental reason for this is that the purchasing power of the poor in those countries isn't that strong, and we need to find a way to do something about that. A fourth area of fourth and last area of agreement is that the economic Cold War is over. We need both effective states and functioning markets. Most people agree on this, and also agree on the related importance of having effective institutions within countries. There are particular debates about whether certain kinds of institutions are better than others, but for the most part, people recognize that we need to do both. And I think that people on both sides of the debate on globalization recognize this. The importance of some of these institutions explains the enormous divergence in outcomes as measured by per capita income in a lot of countries. In 1955, the per capita income of Korea was half that of Nicaragua. In 1999, Korea's per capita income is about 7 times higher than Nicaragua. And you can see this is true not just for per capita income, but for measures of capabilities. You can see that some countries had infant mortality. The lines represent levels of infant mortality, with the top dot being 1967, the bottom dot being 1994. You can see that in the Congo and Zambia, it's barely changed, but in other countries, it's gone down a lot. If you compare Chile and Brazil, they had similar levels of infant mortality about 30 years ago, but it's fallen much steeper in Chile. And I think that has to do with institutions in those countries. At the same time, there's a striking finding, which is that from 1960 to 1979, the average growth in developing countries was about 2.5% a year. From 1980 to 1998, it was about 0.0% a year. So something happened in those two periods. Despite the fact that you had policy improvements in a lot of countries, you didn't have a change in average developing country income in the latter period. And this graph shows what would have happened, what the growth would have been in developing countries if it had followed the trajectory earlier on, and had the same institutions had been in place and that kind of thing. In fact, it's fallen steeply from 1980 onwards. And people aren't exactly sure why. It probably has something to do with the fact that growth in the industrialized countries has been a lot slower. It might have something to do with sort of returns to skills as a result of changes in technology, which developing countries have less of relative to industrialized countries. But this raises the issue that part of the problem is institutions in developing countries, but also has to do with the international environment, the international trading system, and things like that. Both of those are important. So just to summarize, I think that globalization makes international cooperation more urgent morally. We need to build better international institutions. And despite the large disagreements that seem to exist, I don't think they're as large as we fear, and that there are broad areas of agreement on which we can build. Thanks.
I want to talk today about 2 trends in how the U.S. and to some degree other industrialized countries meet their labor needs. And I chose these particular issues for 2 reasons, because they raise important questions about ethics and responsibility, and because they've been controversial topics in policymaking. The first trend involves reliance on undocumented foreign workers and the fact that in the context of globalization and the general opening of borders, immigration is a holdout. States clearly are wary of giving up control over who they let in. In short, we see an expansion of cross-border economic activity parallel with an expansion of policing and monitoring of migration. The second trend is the continued or perhaps increased reliance on temporary foreign labor in developed countries. And after reviewing these themes, I want to look at the 2 dominant approaches in ethical theory addressing immigration and membership. So here I'll overlap with Jack to some degree, and ask how these approaches help us think about the increased control of undocumented migrants and the continued reliance on temporary ones. So the first trend. Across migrant receiving countries, we've seen heightened efforts at border control. During the Clinton presidency, aggressive measures to control undocumented immigration were stepped up under familiar names like Operation Hold the Line, Operation Gatekeeper, Operation Safeguard. These included, just to give a few examples, an 83% increase in the size of the Border Patrol between 1993 and 97, and another doubling by 2001, a near tripling of the INS budget, the building of the triple fence at the border, and increased surveillance equipment used at the border. Now, the question, I think, is what is the intent and efficacy of these policies? The U.S. has traditionally dealt with immigration from Mexico by making symbolic efforts at control while ignoring the entry of Mexicans who come to work. There's a long history of this. For example, the Bracero program, started in 1942, is often cited as the beginning of a rubber stamping of undocumented immigrants. Many undocumented immigrants were either taken straight to employers or were walked across the border and then back in again to be brought in legally. More recently, in an area of the border called the soccer field, which is actually in the U.S., but where there were no official demarcations, border control agents during the 1980s used to sit and watch Mexicans waiting for night to come all the way into the U.S. Even though they were technically in the U.S., they were not apprehended because it was understood that this was neutral territory. There are various sort of, now in the context of border control, kind of amusing examples of Border Patrol agents waving and wishing good luck to people as they cross the borders. The San Diego mayor went and had his picture taken with the soccer field as a backdrop, and students toured the border and spoke with migrants waiting in the soccer field. The current militarization of the border is another example of this, I think. In a recent book, Peter Andreas has argued that the policing of the border has less to do with deterrence than with managing the image of the border. In this sense, he sees the policy of border control as successful even if it fails to deter immigrants. It's successful in bringing in labor while appeasing the public's calls for greater control. There are no indications that our border control policy has significantly reduced the number of undocumented immigrants entering. It has pushed them out of high attention spots and into less populated areas of entry. It's dramatically increased the use of smugglers, and it has pushed migrants into more dangerous areas. Between 1993 and 97, almost 1,200 people died of exposure, dehydration, or drowning, or were hit by cars crossing into the U.S. in these new routes. The policy has also had the perverse effect of changing traditional patterns of going back and forth across the border in favor of staying permanently. Perverse, I mean, based on the stated intent of the U.S. government. The reason for this is, of course, because it's much riskier to go back and forth. Despite this border buildup, it should be stressed that the U.S. has almost totally ineffective employer sanctions for hiring undocumented aliens. This is very different than Europe, or than many countries in Europe. In 1996, only about 2% of the INS budget was devoted to employer sanction enforcement, and that runs totally counter to expert opinion on what we should do if we want to actually control undocumented migration. For example, the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform has said that reducing the employment magnet is the linchpin of a strategy to reduce undocumented immigration. A 1994 presidential report on immigration stated that everyone agrees that the primary incentive for illegal immigration is employment. Workplace enforcement of labor standards and employer sanctions are the instruments for reducing that incentive. Finally, the U.S. has also in large part created the immigration flows that it wishes, or that some people wish to contain. As our keynote speaker has noted in some of her writings, the immigration receiving countries behave as though they were not parties to the process of immigration when they are in fact partners. Leaving aside the history of links between the U.S. and Mexico that created migration, the most obvious way that we create the immigration that we are ostensibly trying to stop, and I should say that the same thing is true for drug flows, illegal drug flows, is through demand. We clearly have a structural demand for labor. It's a demand that doesn't disappear during economic downturns. We've also created immigration by pushing for economic integration. For example, under NAFTA, the integration of markets, including links of transportation, telecommunication, interpersonal acquaintances, etc., all promote the movement of people, including undocumented immigrants and those who overstay visas. Now, the other way that we deal with our seemingly insatiable demand for labor is through documented temporary foreign workers. Everything that we know based on history tells us that temporary immigration, the kind who many people who do want immigration seem to want a lot of, is not, in fact, temporary. People stay because they become rooted in community, they have jobs, they've often joined family, or they've been joined by family. And we, in fact, officially recognize this from time to time with amnesty programs. This is, I should say, probably preferable to the situations in Germany and Japan, where descendants of migrant workers are in their third generation, largely unnaturalized. Nonetheless, amnesty programs as a way to deal with this is fairly ad hoc. Nonetheless, despite what we know about temporary workers, developed countries continue down the same track of insisting on non-settlement for large portions of immigrants, or immigrants who come here for work. Many have cited the elections of Fox in Mexico and Bush in the US as an opportunity for an agreement on migrant issues. But experts warn that that agreement might look like a new guest worker program. There's now a proposal in Congress that would create a temporary foreign worker program to regularize undocumented Mexicans already here and to bring more in for up to 1 year. We've also dramatically increased the number of H-1B visas we give for high-skilled temporary labor, and we're looking abroad for temporary nurses, of which we have a severe shortage. This is not only the case in the US, this reliance on temporary workers. Japan has various ways for temporary workers to come and is often creating more. Germany has just created a program for temporary high-tech workers, which it oddly calls the Green Card program, which just strikes me as strange, considering that they definitely don't want them to settle, and it's like nobody knows over there that ours are called green cards or something. I don't know. In short, the US fills labor shortages with undocumented labor and with temporary foreign labor. Significantly, though, a close reading of the evidence indicates two things. We know our border control policy doesn't work, and we don't necessarily want it to, because we want the undocumented cheap labor. And we know that temporary workers often don't go home when we think that they should. Now, these contradictions are not particularly surprising. Kitty Calavita, an expert on immigration, has pointed out that our immigration policy is the result of three paired oppositions. The first is employer interests versus worker interests, leaving us with no definable national economic interest. The second is economic needs versus the political will to stop immigration through improving enforcement of labor standards, is one example. And the third is democratic principles versus the police functions necessary to control immigration flows. It is therefore exceedingly difficult to identify a national interest regarding immigrants. It's unclear what we want or believe, in part because there's no single we answering that question. Now I want to switch gears here and talk about two dominant ethical traditions. And I hesitate to do that I said to someone earlier that this is like the cliff notes to these two ethical approaches, and I'm doing that with some of the most prominent ethical theorists in the room. But here goes anyway. The two that I want to look at are rooted in communitarianism and cosmopolitanism, and again, this overlaps to some degree with what's been said. These two approaches on this topic generally address two broad questions of state responsibility, both relevant to the themes I've highlighted. One is, are we obligated to let in outsiders, or to what degree are we obligated to let in outsiders? The second is, what are our responsibilities in terms of long-term membership to those who we do let in? The first approach, outlined by Michael Walser, is rooted in communitarianism. And the idea is that communities have rights in and of themselves, and that insofar as state borders are presumptively the outer borders of our community, we have membership obligations to other nationals of our state before those beyond our borders. It is up to the citizens of a country to decide who to admit and what the appropriate criteria for admission are. We should make these decisions in accordance with our own understanding of what membership means in our community and what sort of community we wish to have. Without admission and exclusion control, he argues, there can be no what he calls communities of character, historically stable associations where members have a special sense of a common life. The distinctiveness of closures and groups on this reading depends on closure. If distinctiveness is a value, which he believes most people would argue, then we need closure somewhere, and the place we have closure now in this world is with state borders. In short, admission and exclusion are at the core of communal independence for Walser. They suggest the deepest meaning of self-determination. Now, decisions about admission are based on some constraints, as has already been noted, like the constraint to help those in dire need and not to expel existing inhabitants from territory when a state is formed. Interestingly, Walser argues that while immigration decisions are political ones, naturalization is entirely constrained. Every new immigrant or refugee must have the opportunity for citizenship, according to Walser. The reason behind this is that controlling admission is an act of self-determination, and no state can claim that it is self-determining its fate when decisions are made by only some portion of those affected. This would, for him, be a form of tyranny. His theory then is based on the right of closure necessary for communities and the obligation of political inclusiveness. Now, the second approach, I told you this was the Cliff Notes version, is represented by Joseph Carnes, who was mentioned. This is rooted in liberal cosmopolitanism. The idea here is that state borders, while of great practical significance, may not have moral significance, and that therefore we as individuals and our government should assess our actions based on the idea that all people, regardless of citizenship, are of equal moral worth. He argues that borders should therefore generally be open. People should be free to leave their country of origin and settle in another country, subject to the rules that citizens in that receiving country must abide by. This applies, he thinks, most strongly to migration of those from poorer countries into richer countries. Citizenship, in his now, I think, somewhat famous statement for people who read this literature, citizenship in Western liberal democracies is for him the modern equivalent of feudal privilege. It is an inherited status that greatly enhances one's life chances. He also points out that freedom of movement and the application of universal values is central to our culture. Therefore, if we're making communal decisions based on our culture, we cannot make ones that run counter to it, as he believes closing of borders does. This would not lead, Carnes doesn't think, to no distinctions between communities. He points out that different cities in the US have very different and distinctive cultures, despite the fact that there are no border restrictions between them. It also raises the question of what constitutes communities, because as he argues, which is central to Walser's argument, what constitutes communities. As he points out, Seattle has much more in common with Vancouver than it does with Little Rock. Now, what's interesting to me is that while these two theorists are very far apart on immigration control, regarding long-term integration, they're really very similar. Carnes is a little more specific, but he argues that those allowed to reside and work in a nation should be granted the right to become citizens following a very brief passage of time and some reasonable formalities. Cultural assimilation is not considered reasonable because it assumes that social membership may be defined in terms of social conformity. The children of residents should have the right to citizenship in their state of residence, as is the case in the US. These moral claims, it should be noted, do not, for Carnes, derive from the terms under which people were admitted. It doesn't matter if you were undocumented or not, residence, or if your residency was tied to employment. It's simply a matter of time. He doesn't argue that being a member in some deeper sense is not important, but that participating in a country makes people members. This is especially true for those born and are raised in the country. Now, I think it's easy to dismiss Carnes because his approach is so diametrically opposed to state practice. It's true that even if we agree that citizenship is a form of feudal privilege, most of us have a strong sense that we owe different obligations to those who we view as part of our community. This seems to me part of our intuition or our common sense morality. His strength, though, is to provoke correctly, I think, an uneasiness about our assumptions about the border and to whom we are obligated. To sum up the theoretical approaches, for Walser, control over who to accept comes at the door. For Carnes, it's not up to us to control. But for both, once people are in, they must be granted the opportunity to naturalize. So what do these approaches tell us about the themes that I laid out earlier? Both of the ethical approaches I reviewed would view the use of temporary foreign labor, temporary but de facto long-term migrants to a large degree, without normal procedures for naturalization, to be highly problematic. Perhaps less obviously, I believe that both would find our border control policies questionable. At first glance, we might say that our border control policies run totally counter to what Carnes sees as our obligations, essentially open borders, but that they're in line with Walser's idea that we have a right to decide who to let in. I think, though, that Walser's analysis would be more complicated than this. For Walser, the idea of keeping people out rests on a communal decision, a communal decision that is what we want. I indicated earlier that in most developed countries, and certainly in the US, there is no such communal consensus, no definition of the national interest, no clear idea of what we want. But maybe there is a consensus, and if there is, I think it's that we want migrant labor, but not immigrants. But bringing in foreign labor but not immigrants, in the context that I've laid out, is having it both ways in a manner that Walser would find unacceptable. It's unacceptable to have a facade of border control. This places full responsibility for migrating on the part of the undocumented migrants, and full of responsibility for something that we both allow and encourage. It's also unacceptable, based on both authors' views of integration, to base policy on a preference for workers but not immigrants, when we know that looking over time and across countries, large numbers of those migrant workers will not leave. They become rooted in their lives here because they live here. Both scholars agree that citizenship must be granted after a brief stay. Since we know that we are both encouraging, or at the very least not discouraging, undocumented immigration, and we know that temporary workers have historically not been temporary, the insistence on both of those policies raises, I think, serious ethical questions, regardless of the perspective that we take. Based on these ethical approaches, it seems to me that border control either needs to be a real commitment without the implicit okaying of undocumented labor coming in, or it needs to not exist in the form that it does. Temporary worker programs, I think, must either find a way to truly be temporary or include a means of becoming permanent. Either approach, I think, leads us to significant change from the policies that we now have. Thanks.
It's pretty intuitive to think that a world economy that is, deeply integrating and globalizing in fundamental ways would raise people's attention to questions of governance structures that are sort of suited to an economy of that scope and scale. And the simple starting point would be something like this, a global economy, global governance. It's not absurd. In fact, it's almost intuitive to think that as people and companies and nation states increasingly think and do business and transact across a global economy, they would turn to global institutions to provide the governance they need to make that system work. And so for me, that seems like a kind of a reasonable null hypothesis. Global economy, global governance. And so the question with any good null hypothesis is it right? I'm actually highly motivated to believe that it's right because, after all, I study international organizations and global governance for a living. But actually, I think it's probably going to be wrong. And draw your own conclusions from that. I think that globalization is actually going to probably be bad for global governance, at least of the type that's typically provided by international organizations. And I'm going to basically take a quick shot at 4 reasons why I think that is the case. First of all, I think globalization is turning out to be a challenge to many institutions, if not all institutions. But I think international organizations are particularly vulnerable. More vulnerable than states, more vulnerable than firms, more vulnerable even than labor unions. And I think the reason for that is very, very simple. Nation states, firms, labor unions, each of these things have solid constituencies. They have primary effective connections or interests with individual human beings. There are nationalists, for better or for worse, and there are people who think of themselves as employees and customers and workers and so on and so forth. So who has an effective connection with the World Bank, aside from maybe the people who work at the World Bank? How many people owe a primary loyalty to the World Trade Organization? Right? Now, even as you ask that question, the answers become obvious. I mean, you can talk about many of the reasons why that is, and for political scientists, why some of the neo-functionalist perspectives on that question were probably wrong. But I think the bottom line from observation is simply that political life, for most people, most of the time is still really quite a local thing, even if economic life is increasingly global. And so my point in this is that it's not only sort of for the neoliberal academic theorists who saw international organizations as what we call transaction cost reducers, performing functional services basically for other actors, everybody else sees it that way too. And it's really hard to feel love or even loyalty towards a transaction cost reducer. Now, why is this important? I think it's important because I think and I'm not being facetious, I think the effective affiliations of love and loyalty and things like that will actually become more important as technology moves money markets towards actually more perfect structures with lower transaction costs. You've got to believe in institutions for them to work, and nobody really has a good reason to believe in international organizations. They have a lot to prove, and they have to prove it on an ongoing basis about their functionality, about their significance, about whether or not they add value to a world economy. And I'm going to argue later that that's a hard thing to do and that, in fact, it's been getting harder. One of the reasons it's been getting harder is because people pay attention to the fact that international organizations are hobbled by what is typically called a democratic deficit. Transparency, accountability, never really high on the agenda for most international organizations. In many cases, it was actively opposed. The World Bank, to a much lesser degree, actually, the IMF have made some serious steps in the last few years to change that situation and open themselves up, at least moderately. But when you look at international organizations as a sort of a broad category, they are some of the most opaque organizations, public or private, on Earth. It's a lot easier to look at the financial reports of a major U.S. corporation listed on the New York Stock Exchange than it is to find out how the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development spends its money. I think that's a bad thing, particularly if an organization seeks to establish credibility as a kind of impartial umpire. That was my first point. Let me turn to the second point. International organizations were supposed to contribute to social justice in the world economy. And the way in which they were supposed to do that, at least the organizations we have today, I feel are a product of an intellectual trajectory that was connected to the last phase of globalization, right? Not to what is happening in the beginning of the 21st century. Let me tell you why I think that is. Much of the driving force behind the creation of the sort of the new generation of international organizations, which began after World War II, in the second half of the 20th century, lay quite simply in the promotion of growth in world commerce. That's what they were about. They were about promoting growth in world commerce, particularly among new and emerging industries, and those that weren't specifically about commerce were about creating the political and particularly the security preconditions for that growth. That's a little bit of an overstatement, but not enormously. International organizations in this era were tied very tightly to what people call commercial liberalism, which was simply the idea, commercial liberals believed, that economic interaction sort of naturally brings together what political boundaries tend to separate. For the generation that grew up after World War II, commerce was supposed to be the major counterpart to conflict and war. And so naturally, the international organizations of the second half of the 20th century were in large part about preventing World War III through commercial liberalism. And so the international organizations of the post-war era were built around that logic. They were built around a world which was dominated by trade in heavy industrial goods, by concerns about deindustrialization of the South, by worries about shortages of capital, or at least problems in allocating capital to where it was supposed to go, and ultimately and fundamentally by state-to-state political foundations. And to a certain degree, that sort of intellectual logic made sense for the the second half of the 20th century. The question is, are those foundations still in place? Is that still what we need to be doing for a world economy? Actually, I don't think so. And I'm going to come back to why that is. But I want to mention that that intellectual legacy is still at the core of international organizations. And there's a sort of irony here. The irony is this kind of ascendancy of commercial embedded liberalism as a set of assumptions just when the world economy is moving into a phase of globalization that could render organizations based on that principle superfluous. Now let me say why I think that is, my third point. International organizations were sold to the public as promoting and sustaining liberalization in the interests of social justice? Are they important contributors to that objective? I'm not sure, actually, and I think the track record is really quite uneven. Why do I say that? Well, you know, promoting and sustaining liberalization is not the same thing as promoting social justice. That's obvious. The relationship is actually highly contingent, even if you accept the idea that, well, you know, as the World Bank has shown, liberalization along with good governance contributes substantially to the growth rate of developing countries. The broader question, which is at issue for international organizations, is, you know, whether one can make a big general case that commerce, development, and defense, together as they are conceptualized within international organizations, contribute to a system that somehow promotes social justice over time. So here we are with 50 years of evidence for a generation of organizations. It's very, very hard to know the answer. I mean, there are some really obvious confounding data points. At the end of the 19th century, the ratio between the richest and the poorest countries in the world, as you know, if you take the measurements of the data seriously at that time, was a factor of about 8. At the end of the 20th century, it was a factor of about 45. That's a big difference in the wrong direction. That's not very just on the face of it. The question is, would that state of affairs have been worse, or, you know, alternatively, might it have been better if you could sort of rerun the history of the second half of the 20th century without international organizations? That's a really hard question. It's an exquisitely complex counterfactual. I know I can't answer it. I know I don't have sufficient evidence or theoretical knowledge to answer it. My point is that people are asking that question, I think, now in a very serious way. And they're realizing that, you know, the only reason, the only evidence really ultimately that we have to link those two things together, that can link international organization and the pursuit of social justice together, is a chain of human reasoning. Not a lot more, and not a lot of data. And the problem is, the links in that chain, I think, are being weakened by globalization at the start of the 21st century. And that's what I want to spend the last few minutes of my talk talking about. There are a couple of reasons I think that's true. I think the links of that logic are going to be weakened. First reason I think that's the case. I think globalization is exacerbating a kind of fundamental tension between what I call global knowledge and local knowledge. The principle of the whole idea of having international organizations rests on an implicit, well, sometimes implicit notion that there exists some set of universal services or global knowledge or global goods, things that people or states all over the world should know, you know, should do, or would benefit from. Maybe we're done with those kinds of universals, that universal principles of international organization, that everybody really ought to and should do the same thing, that these things fit more comfortably with older notions of globalization, and they're gone, and they should be gone. In fact, those kinds of predictions have turned out to be wrong for most previous generations of economic change, and they probably will do the same thing for this generation. What I see when I look out in the world economy is technology turning many things into commodities that in fact do become global universals, and then they go through markets. And then creating an increasing premium for those things that really can't be commodified. And the most important thing that can't be commodified is local tacit knowledge, what people actually know about their own political, social, and economic arrangements. That's not something that IOs deal in effectively, right? They just don't. The whole notion of the growing attractiveness of what people talk about as subsidiarity as a governing principle, not only in the European Union but elsewhere. The notion that decisions ought to be made at the most local level possible reflects some of that thinking. It doesn't favor international organizations. And the point I'm really making is that globalization demands governance, yes. But it's wrong to assume that the demand is for global governance. The demand could very well be for local governance and regional governance, right? And to the extent that the places where global governance really is at stake, the IO bureaucracies now have to contend with new forms of competition from private actors, right? Notably the big accounting firms like Andersen and Ernst & Young, quasi-public organizations in which I would put Moody's, Investor Services, and the Mafia together. And I mention those kinds of organizations just to make the point that if it's a battle over efficiency, the outcome is sort of predetermined. Right? I'll come back to that point about who might have an advantage in legitimacy, which is different than efficiency, at the end. Let me make a second quick point about this. I think if there is a growth area for supranational governance, it could very well be in regional, not global institutions. Regionalism got a bad name in the 50s and the 60s, and generally for good reasons. Many regional organizations tend to be protectionist. They tended to be discriminatory. There's a new regionalism that is growing up in the world that is worth paying attention to. I like to talk about Europe as an example of a regionalism which differs actually for the better from the old regionalism. Think of Europe today, a place that is quite large, larger in population than the United States. I talk about the European Union. Expansive, nearly continental, potentially even transcontinental in scope. The old Europe, the old region, was made up of nations that were culturally, politically, economically, and even to a certain degree religiously homogeneous. The new Europe is quite heterogeneous. Culture, politics, economics, religion. As the EU expands in the next few years to include former Eastern European countries, it will actually break new ground in the gradual process of trying to incorporate developed and developing countries in a deep integration scheme. Europe is doing that. There is no similar kind of integration in a significant way at the global level. At the regional level, supranational organization is moving away from older paradigms. This new Europe is, for the most part, outwardly directed, export-driven, focused on attracting investment and technology. If that is a sort of a dominant regional paradigm, it's probably a popular one. To the extent that it works, it takes energy away from global institutions. Now, it's possible to say that these sort of regional institutions will end up being a sort of sub-foundation of a new global regime, but I don't think that's assured by any means. They could just as well be a replacement. Okay. Third, very brief point. I don't want to make a big deal out of this except to say that globalization accelerates innovation. That's something we're sort of all familiar with in our day-to-day lives. And IOs are just, international organizations are just not particularly good at innovation. That's not a criticism, it's a characterization. They are, for the most part, large multifunctional bureaucracies. Large multifunctional bureaucracies are not great at innovation. But the bottom line is that IOs weren't set up to be innovators. States didn't want international organizations to innovate. They wanted international organizations as agents of lock-in. They wanted them to stabilize their international order. And that is a pretty hard legacy to get unshackled from. There are lots of competitors, and I think it's going to get harder. Let me make a last point. And in some ways, probably the most important and most interesting one. If I had time, I'd develop it further. Most of what I've talked about has been sort of functional claims to governance, efficiency claims to governance. And if you accept the argument that international organizations are sort of losing some of that functional claim to governance, you would then have to sort of ask, what about legitimacy? Is there some kind of legitimacy that attaches to international organizations which is special? I think they're losing their legitimacy too, and I think it's the most interesting transformation. Here's why I think this briefly. International organizations were supposed to be kind of repositories of rational legal authority and technical expertise. And that matters greatly for Weberians. But I wonder how much it actually continues to matter in a 21st century globalizing world economy. Here's why. Communications technologies and all the cultural and intellectual changes that go along with that are undermining institutions that were built for an era of high transaction costs and impacted information. That's what ultimately made people respect formal authority and technical expertise. Weber understood that. He wouldn't have rendered it in those terms. But IOs are going to feel the pressure of change on that. They're going to feel the pressure because international organizations can't really claim special status anymore as pluralist organizations. I mean, it used to be that you could say, as the World Bank or the IMF, that we are a place where every state is a member, or can be a member, and on nominally equal terms, the United Nations. And that was distinctive. The distinctiveness of being a place where everybody could be a member is going away. Ultimately, because technology, communications technology, reduces the marginal cost of adding one more voice to an asymptote of zero. Right? So the default for organizations is really changing from who do you include, from from who do you include to who do you exclude. You have to make a conscious choice to exclude someone. And international organizations just look less special in this world. I think they're going to feel the pressure of chipping away of rational legal authority manifested in large bureaucracies. And they're going to feel the pressure from alternative sources of expertise. Since, after all, the barriers to entry have fallen for control over the channels through which claims of expertise flow. And I think you see this in the world today as a kind of a leaking of legitimacy away to other actors. You know, Nike now thinks of itself as a labor rights organization. You know, Shell promotes itself as an environmental NGO, right? Monsanto has become a global nutrition organization. And mutual funds with social justice criteria are human rights NGOs. And I think that that is a real phenomenon, and you have to keep track of it and pay attention to it. So let me finish up with a real quick story about a source of strength. It's always a good thing to do to folks at the end of the day, you know, on sort of the creative side of creative destruction, and ask what is happening if IOs shrink in importance. I mentioned a couple of other competitors, you know, some regional organizations, international crime syndicates, Ernst & Young. I just want to tell a very brief story that illustrates what could be good and bad about that process. And it's a personal story about something that I did a couple of years ago. Just take 2 minutes. I worked with a natural resources company, you know, which have a certain reputation for managing their relations with less developed countries in a particular manner, who were looking at buying a copper mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo, because this was the best copper mine in the world. And it was available very cheap. Why was it available very cheap? Because there is a huge war going on in Congo in which there are about 7 or 8 countries involved. Right? And so that's why it was available very cheap, because nobody else thought they could go there. Huge opportunity. Exists fundamentally. I mean, the reason that mine was so cheap was because of a failure of governance. Domestic governance, essentially non-existent in Congo at the time, and global governments ultimately, because international institutions were doing nothing to stop that war, nothing of substance, to stop that war in Congo. And this natural resources company understood that they couldn't capitalize on the opportunity without helping to solve the problem. Because in an interesting way for them, the easy pickings were already gone. I mean, you know, the copper mines in nice, comfortable, stable political environments like, you know, Colorado are already developed, and they're expensive. You know, the way you get copper cheap is you go to a place like Congo. So they came to understand that if it were possible to capitalize on this opportunity, they would actually have to play some kind of positive role in picking up the leftover governance that wasn't being done by others in that realm. And here was the really interesting phenomenon. A senior vice president of this company looked at me and said, "We don't know how to do that." And then he said, "But we have to learn." And it was a really poignant moment, because ultimately it brought me to understand that for all these macro arguments, ultimately this becomes a question about individual people, whether or not they see themselves as having, in one sense, the responsibility to act, and in another sense, the knowledge and the capability to act, and finally, the courage to act, right? The courage to change themselves to respond to the needs of the environment in which they're operating, rather than trying to sort of bend that environment to their short-term profit incentives. And for me, that was a real upside, because it was ultimately a story about people, not about huge bureaucratic organizations, governmental or otherwise. And you know that people have values and interests that go far beyond the narrow motives and responsibilities that companies have to pay attention to. Now, there are a lot of downsides to that story as well, which I'm sure we all know. There's democratic accountability, so on and so forth. So let me end with just this very simple comment. I mean, there was sort of relative pessimism, in my view, about the role of global institutions to bring greater equity and social justice to a larger percentage of the world's population than we managed to deal with in the first half of the 20th century. I think governments and international organizations were good at some parts of this and bad at others. I would end by just saying I think we are about to find out in a really big way how private actors and corporations compare. And that's worth watching.